what's really common in Denmark now. So there were trucks coming and leaving all day, bringing in manure from the farm, and then taking digested effluent back to the storage right at the farm. So we'll talk a little bit about how they did that, what I saw, and then what it means. All right, so why Denmark and why did I get invited? So there you can see me and Dan Cholkis from Penn State University, and we're standing in front of the swine embassy there, and got a nice picture next to a statue. But a few of the things that Denmark does and what I came away with is Denmark has been a world leader in renewable energy for a while now. You probably know them for their wind and their wind energy. They're pretty big into solar, and then they are one of the leaders in biogas production. So currently, where they are is about 40% of all the natural gas they use is renewable natural gas. So quite a high percentage, and they've been doing a few things to get there, including trying to electrify as much as possible and reduce natural gas demand, but also really focused on anaerobic digestion to supply the industries where they know they need that natural gas. Electricity being one of them. While they're wind and solar, their idea is to use renewable natural gas basically for topping or to balance up the loads when they don't have enough wind or solar. And the other thing that I took away from what I saw in Denmark is they digest a ton of their manure. 40% of all the liquid manure and all the solid manure that is produced in Denmark is run through an anaerobic digester. So rather than maybe the European systems that I'd seen before, like in Germany where you think of digesters on a single farm, they had to take this to another scale, right? It was big, it was lots of farms working together, moving manure around to get it to these digesters. So it has become, rather than sort of a cottage industry or a farm individual industry, something that's really moved to mainstream, and there's a lot of focus on infrastructure to make this work and happen. So a little different, I wanted to start with some key takeaways about what I saw, why this was working there, and how to keep it moving forward. Like most places, energy credits, especially for green energy credits, is still a primary driver in making it work. They mentioned over and over again that it took farmer involvement, private industry, equity investment, but also policy from the government to support it, right? And they had looked at this as a long-term trend that they needed to do. They did have natural gas wells in the North Sea. They implied that those were getting lower and less certain, so they wanted to think about what was the ways to replace those. And then they've seen some energy price surges with basically the war in Russia and other concerns about energy in Europe, and this was a way forward. The other thing that they really focused on is that farmers there were recognizing real, measurable economic benefits, and those were increasing. That was partially from return of the nutrients in the digest state, but a lot of it was that they were invested in the digester plants themselves. They generally weren't the majority owner. They owned small shares in the digester, but they did get some of the return from that industry. The other thing that we saw was they were moving to a much harsher carbon reality. So there was a tax on livestock emissions, cropping emissions, that was really making farmers think about what is the role they can play. Because if their manure was going to a digester, they got to avoid those taxes on the carbon emissions, essentially. So there were some opportunities there to think about it not just as a credit gain, but how do we keep farming and have a social license to operate. And then the other thing that they really pointed out is that co-digestion was essential. So manure makes up the majority of their substrates, and we'll look at the things they're digesting in a little bit. But they were taking a lot of other things, and they had thought really carefully about what does that mean, what's the social acceptability of this, and how do we make sure even if we take other things, farmers still want it as a fertilizer product. And then the last one is scale is necessary. These plants were getting relatively large. They generally were somewhere in the neighborhood of 20-25 farms hauling manure to a single digester working together. Now their farms aren't typically as big as they are here in America, but they were getting a large number of farms to work together to make these systems pencil out. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about why should we care and what did I see in Denmark and how does that compare to Midwestern agriculture, but especially Iowa. So Denmark, when we got there, they said we raise 28 million pigs annually, and I thought for a second, wow, they raise as many as I do, and they reported a little differently. I normally think I have 25 million pigs in Iowa, but they report number of finished, so I'm trying to give a heads-to-heads comparison here. So they have 28 million pigs, we have 40 million pigs, right? So a little bit bigger. They have 1.5 million head of cattle, we're 3.5 million head of cattle, so again, a little bit bigger, but when you look at that acreage, we have 3 times the land base that they have, right? So that led to some different manure situations. They have areas that are extremely dense, look just like Iowa. They have a few areas where it's more urban than Iowa. I would say that their manure regulations tend to be a little bit stronger than ours are, going so far as they even have a carbon tax on manure and livestock carbon emissions, whereas we have some increasing nutrient management concerns. They had been through that, right? And they, being a coastal country with a lot of oceanfront property, are really aware of the impact that has because they're a shipping, fishing country. So that has a noticeable impact on their economy if they have water quality challenges or concerns. They have set stronger renewable energy goals than we have as a country, but even here there's some low carbon fuel opportunities, so relatively similar. The biggest difference I saw is they went to that community co-op digester model where we're still single farm. And then the last thing was just when you do an energy comparison, energy there was 2 to 3 times more expensive than what we tend to be paying here. But overall, Denmark saw an agriculture and a landscape pretty similar to ours and asked how do we turn that into something that we can take advantage of in our energy policy while supporting rural development and agricultural economics. So a lot of similarities going on, and I thought that was interesting and something that I didn't recognize before I got there. So I just wanted to show you a picture of where we got to and a little bit about the countryside in Denmark. So if you're wondering where Copenhagen is, it's not on the peninsula, it's on the island right here, right next to them. We did get to take a ferry ride across the ocean to get there, but most of the time we were taking bridges and traveling by bus around the country. On the right-hand map there, they had mapped out all their existing biogas plants as of 2024. And you can see there's a pretty good smattering on the map. It's scaled by size. But their industry has been growing pretty rapidly, especially in scale and number of facilities that are going to a digester. And they're pretty proud of that 40% of their manure is digested and that 40% of their natural gas is from renewable sources. So things that were pretty exciting and also pretty impressive numbers, especially if you compare it to maybe where we sit today. I did want to show you a little bit of how they got there and why they got there. So really, starting in 2012, they had come to an agreement that they were going to support biogas and some policy incentives to do that. And that's really when you see maybe that explosion in agricultural biogas digesters. The number they have on industrial wastewaters and wastewater treatment stayed pretty constant. So what they did mostly focused on how do we scale this bigger into agriculture. So they really had taken advantage of the North Sea gas fields in the 80s, and that had started to run lower, and they're really in that transition from black energies to green energies. And while they're focused on methane today, I do think they have a pretty good eye on the future, looking at what might come next after methane and what can methane be upgraded into, going so far as to make green plastics, hopefully for Lego, while they're there. Okay, so the first thing I really wanted to talk about is are they digesting and how does that relate to where biogas is coming from. So you can see that 75-80% of all the stuff going into their digester by weight is livestock manure, but it only counts for about 35% of all the biogas they're actually producing. And I think we recognize that, right? Manure makes a great starting point. We have a great developing industry here in the United States that's related to livestock manure, but it's been pre-digested by the animal, and that takes a lot of the biogas potential out of it before we get to process it and deal with it. So they aren't really a one-to-one, right? It makes up the base of a lot of what they're taking, but really it's a smaller percentage of the gas production. Where they tend to be getting a lot of their gas relative to what they're taking in is industrial residues. And to them, industrial residues were basically two things. It was either wastewater from dairies, so dairy processing facilities, cheese, butter, ice cream, what have you, or from slaughter facilities. And they had made a big push to try and get as much of that material to go to a biogas plant as possible. And you can sort of see why, right? It's generally accounting for 10 to 15% of all the stuff going in, but probably making about a third of the gas production potential of all the material that's coming in. So a pretty big slice of the pie. The other one that's an extremely small amount of what they're actually digesting is glycerin. And in terms of gas production, that stuff is impressive, right? You have to manage it carefully when you're balancing it into a digester to make sure you don't sour your digester, but a lot of gas production potential. They made a big point while we were there that they do think about energy crops, but currently energy crops are a small part of what they're doing. Historically, energy crops there had meant digesting corn silage. Denmark really doesn't want to digest corn silage. They are interested in other biomass crops, but it hasn't been a big part of what they're doing so far, and that's an opportunity they see as they look to the future, is what can we do with some crop residues, straws, and potential for energy crops, but relatively small parts of what they're digesting right now. Okay, so this was one of the first digesters that was put in Denmark, and it was really very similar to what we see in the United States. It was digesting 10,000 tons of manure annually, and it was used for heat and power. So they were making electricity and then using waste heat in the area around them. And as we traveled the countryside and looked at some of the digesters, they actually had a fair number that were still doing this, where they had waste heat available and were close enough to communities, they would have community heating coming from the digester. And that's not something we see a lot of in the United States. We tend to have individual home heating rather than using water heating for an entire town. So a little bit different of an infrastructure in what was happening, but still that was part of their focus of how do we maximize efficiency and get the most out of digesters as we're using them. This digester is about 30 years old, still in good condition. It's been repaired a time or two, but has been operating pretty much continuously since it was built. So they did share this slide with us on their biogas system today, and really they're thinking, how do we scale bigger? How do we make this really industrialized so that we can have good instrumentation and high management for success? They do take both solid and liquid manure. They're going to call their solid manure deep litters. We generally would call them something like a bedded pack, right? It's cattle on bedding or pigs on bedding, but it is solid manure that was being moved to the digester. They do take some industrial waste. We talked that's mostly slaughterhouses and dairies. They tend to avoid hauling sewage sludge into agricultural digesters. That isn't something that they want to have to manage in terms of what's being applied to the landscape. And their food waste program is pretty evolved. They do have separation systems in homes and businesses where as you're emptying your tray from your meals, you put it into different portions, some that would go to incineration, and then the organic residues that could go to a digester that gets picked up, blended, and brought to digesters on trucks. If you are taking food waste, that does have to go through a pasteurization process. I'll show you a couple of pictures of how that happened. And then it went to a digester. They tended to use relatively large gas cleaning systems. We mostly saw amine scrubbing systems, which are relatively low energy use, relatively efficient, but tend to be best for extremely large plants. So I haven't seen a large number of them in the U.S., but that was really their focus. Bring the cost down, make it as efficient as possible. And then the big thing that I saw and paid attention to is how they were moving stuff around. So every time they brought a load of manure in from a farm, that truck was going out with a load of digestate to put into the manure storage on that farm. So it was a well-oiled machine, and we'll try and take some pictures of what we really looked through. So first off, we have the manure generators. They did take us to a dairy farm. We did not get to go into a swine barn. Biosecurity issues do tend to make that a little more challenging, but we did get to see a barn. They're raising mostly Holsteins. You can see that red speckled one. That's a Danish red. My family has some history coming from Denmark, and that was what they had originally milked before they switched to Holsteins, and that was the first Danish red I ever got to see in person. So it was interesting, but more importantly, their dairy barn there, you can see it has a slatted floor. It was a shallow pit. They do use a Lally robot to clean the walkways and collect manure. And then they had some bed pack areas for maternity pens, calves, yearlings, things like that. So this manure was getting collected every other week and hauled to the digester. As we look at what was happening at the digester, just a picture for you. So there's the tanker that they were hauling in on. On the top of that tanker there's a pump in the back, a swing arm, and then these snorkels were located out through the building. So you'd pull up, lower your snorkel right down into that funnel, pump your load off, right? So it went relatively quick. It was in a building, so it was contained. And then within that building, these were the exhaust vents, so they're trying to pull the air through there and providing some odor treatment of what's going on. Right, so since there's a lot of manure moving around, they had a lot of thought into what could be done for odor control to minimize impact on the environment around them and the neighborhoods around them. Similarly with some solid manure collection, it was arriving on trucks. Each truck had a tarp on top. They'd back up, dump it into the pit, And then the interesting part to me was you can see that yellow crane in the back with this claw, right? Just like in Toy Story 3, the claw drops down and it picks stuff up. That both was to load it into the digester, and they would use it for some mixing. One of the things that I think it's hard to maybe appreciate in a picture is how big that crane is. I will admit I'm not the tallest person, but that crane was a good 6 feet tall, so it was heavy duty. I wanted to show you just a little bit about what they're doing with food waste. Food waste wasn't unloaded within the building. They had a special port that they were unloading it to in the back of the building. Same idea, truck pulls up, pump, hook it up with, in this case, hoses, just like you use for manure application, and it gets loaded into these pasteurization tanks. So they had 2 tanks, and each load of food waste that would come in would be pasteurized for 30 minutes to an hour, heated up to a specified temperature, hold it there to inactivate it and make sure that it wouldn't have any repercussions on land application later. After it was run through that, it did go through the digester just like everything else. One of the things that we saw while we were there in terms of digester technology was in the US, most digesters are run mesophilic or around 35 degrees Celsius. They were tending to run a lot of their digesters thermophilic for a couple reasons. One, they had increased demand or capacity at these digesters throughout the year. So many of those digesters started out running mesophilic, and they said, we need to run more material through these. They found one way to do that was increase the temperatures, move to thermophilic, and since they had strong levels of management there, it was working fine for them. They did have digesters that were still running mesophilic, and they basically said the trade-off is if you heat it up more, you can reduce that retention time, and it's sort of a game you want to play about what you have, what's coming in, and then sort of how long can I really hold it based on what I have there before I need to build new digesters. I did want to show you just a few pictures of the pre-processing. The picture on the right there is mixing of bedding pack manure. So it would drop down, take a scoop, drop it, and do that until it was reasonably well mixed, so just a few drops, and then it would start loading it into the hopper right next to it. That goes into the digester. The picture on the left was an industrial digester. In this case, it was some organic material that was attached to perlite in the process that they were using. They'd separate the perlite and they wanted to digest that material. It was relatively harsh, right? That's a dirt with organic material mixed on it. They're using that same crane to mix it and make a mud solution, but they were having success digesting it. But it was interesting to see that crane maybe working on 2 very diverse substrates and still having some effectiveness at mixing and seeing what's going on. So within their digesters, they were really focused on system efficiency. So at most of the facilities that we visited, they had somewhere between 6 and 12 digesters at the moment operating. So pretty good in size. Each one was 1 million to 2 million gallons roughly in size. Generally, like I said, running mesophilic or thermophilic. About half the digesters we saw were thermophilic, half of them were mesophilic. This was just a picture of the bottom side where they had some heat exchangers, so as material was either going into or out of that digester, either some preheating or heat recovery. Some of these heat exchangers did move the residual heat off to community for community heating. So it would just be a hot water solution that was separate and recycled. So just a picture of the amine scrubbing system. Again, like I said, I haven't seen too many of these in the US, but there are a few. I have had the opportunity to see them before. So an amine scrubbing solution is just one way to remove CO2. Basically, you're making a amine solution, so it's slightly basic. CO2 loves to stick into that amine solution, so you can make a methane with hydrogen sulfide, essentially, a portion of the gas, and the CO2 sticks in that liquid amine tower. When you heat that up, you can get the CO2 to come out, and that's what they were doing, right? So heat recovery often was from there, and that could be used as waste heat to heat the digester or as waste heat to heat a community nearby. So taking advantage of sort of the system efficiency they could do from that. Amine cleaning doesn't tend to scale down to as small of cleaning systems as we've often seen in the US, where we might be picking membranes, but at big facilities it does tend to be pretty cost effective. They did have additional hydrogen sulfide removal systems on the gas streams. One of the things that we actually got to see, that truck right there and the towers behind it, was a CO2 recovery system. So this was CO2 that they're going to take back to their North Sea wells where they had historically gotten natural gas and inject that back into the ground for CO2 storage. It was their first truck, so it was mostly in testing, and the well field wasn't quite ready. So in this case, after they loaded the truck, we did get to see them just off-gas the truck and vent it to the atmosphere, but it was proving that the technology was working to recover CO2, and we didn't get to get too close, right, because they were still in the testing phases. But that is one of the things that they were looking at or thinking about as they move towards the future of what might be the next phases of anaerobic digestion. They are also focused on methane to chemicals, essentially. What are the building blocks that they could make, including all the way up to plastics. One of the most interesting stops for me on the tour was they had us talk to their gas company. So the gas company is run by the government, and one of the things they made a point of is that it was critical that you get a gas grid that works with anaerobic digestion facilities. And that was really two parts. Sometimes the demand where they need that natural gas isn't located where the digestion facilities were. So they had a lot of thought going into how can we run portions of the grid backwards, or essentially where it had been a distribution system before. Now that there's a digester there and it has to take in a fair amount of gas, how do we take that gas in and have capacity in our pipe network to use it there? So they're in the process of upgrading the grid, and they are under a government mandate that if you propose a digester, they have to do their best to accept that biogas and figure out how to always let you use that piping system, rather than saying we're at capacity and we can't take any more. So I think that level of cooperation was interesting, and then the cost of hooking up was actually lower than what we see in the United States, which is not what I expected, right? We normally think of Europe being a little more expensive. In this case, both their digesters and their gas grid hookups tend to be cheaper than what we currently get here. When that material comes out of the anaerobic digester, they do keep it on site for about 60 more days as part of a degassing process, so letting the residual methane come out. They store that in covered manure storages. It could be these dome covers. It could be just the tarp covers that you tend to see. But they do try and make them gas tight for some recovery. In that domed one, you can see that they're actually doing gas recovery and putting that gas in with the gas they're recovering from the digesters. That helps with both odor control, but also, since a large focus of this was on methane reduction, it's making sure that we don't have methane leakage back to the atmosphere after adding materials together and maybe not getting complete digestion within the anaerobic digester itself. And then they did have a large focus on digestate delivery back to the farm. I showed you that snorkel, so we're basically back to where we started. Right there's a snorkel they would unload into. In this case, though, they were just pumping from basically a reception pit that's under the barn back into the truck and loading it backwards. So every truck that came in would come in with manure, and it would leave with digestate. It did get washed in between, so it was mostly washing to keep it clean, but there was a wash and disinfect, especially if they were switching farms to go somewhere else. As they haul it back to the facility, I think in my mind I had this idea of how are they doing that? Aren't they using whatever the manure storage is at the farm? And in some cases that is true, but they've also taken advantage of this system to say once we've got it on a truck, we could be taking it out to a field or a reception pit in the field to make it closer to land application. And farmers had started to invest in some of their manure storage tanks within fields to make that more feasible. But they did make a big point that they were trying to be circular with their nutrients, get them to where they need them, just like we have in the Midwest. So there were a few ingredients that they really pointed to as why they're being successful at this and why it's working for them. And I will fully state that policy support is a big part of that. And one of the things that they've recognized is rather than just policy support that gets implementation, they were really focused on policy support that provided stability to the market. So you didn't build an asset and worry that the market was going to go away. They were focused on 10 to 15 year contracts so that you could feel comfortable getting into the market and making it work. The government has invested a fair amount in natural gas infrastructure and thinking about how to upgrade their natural gas system to work with anaerobic digestion facilities scattered throughout the countryside, thinking about how do they run some of that piping, which was basically flowing from the North Sea before into the country, to how do we flow from some of those agricultural regions back up towards the North Sea. And then they made a big point about farmer participation. And they illustrated to us that Denmark had a large history of cooperatives. Alla is sort of a Swedish-Danish company But it was started by farmers, and the farmers worked together to supply the milk to these processing plants, but the farmers were owners of the processing plant as well. So farmers had a history of thinking about being co-owners and working through the entire value chain, not just I'm a producer of raw materials. And one of the things that they were really proud of on that is trying to do so in a way that kept more value within agriculture and within Denmark. Right? So how do we help use this as policy that supports agriculture rather than just policy that supports energy independence? And I think when I look at Iowa, I see a lot of the same things, right? We have a large amount of biomass. We've already invested heavily in bioenergy, often in ethanol. But how do we maybe link those systems together? And I think we have the pieces and we see some of that integration. But to really take advantage and move towards what Denmark did, it'll take a little more strategic thinking and maybe some policy support that more long-term incentivizes that type of system development. I would say from what I saw, given what they did, they looked at anaerobic digestion and said it's a great platform, not a single technology, right? We can work with the farms we have, we can work with agricultural waste that we have, and the future might be thinking about how do we upgrade this. And to them, flexibility was key. They didn't know what fuel source was going to be the winner long term, but they said we can use methane now for renewable natural gas, heat, electricity, and maybe long term to support the shipping industry. So they thought, given that history, if we move towards a hydrogen economy, this could be a part of it. If we want methanol, methane to methanol is a relatively easy transformation, and also it can make plastics. So they saw a lot of opportunity that I think would play well here in Iowa or the Midwest as well. I think one thing that they were really pointing out to us, and that I see the same constraint of in Iowa, while we have a lot of livestock, a lot of manure, that works well for a carbon mitigation strategy and reducing agricultural emissions. If we want it to be an energy production strategy, we probably have to think beyond manure only into what other residues do we have that can help scale up gas production. And then finally, I did want to point out they were thinking quite a bit about what does that fertilizer product look like as it goes back to the farm. And they were covering it to help reduce ammonia losses during storage before they get it land applied. They do think a little bit about, is solid liquid separation necessary? They focused on not solid liquid separating and mostly using that material as is. They have done some solid liquid separation if they are surface applying, mostly to help that material soak into the ground faster and again reduce ammonia volatilization, which European regulations are pretty strict about. I think from my perspective, and theirs as well, they were interested in what sort of cropping systems could happen there, what biomass crops might we take advantage of our crop residues. But on that front, I thought they actually were relatively similar to us. They were exploring it, they were thinking about possibilities there, but they have not moved towards, should we be harvesting cover crop biomass? Should we be harvesting some of our straws or soaked overs? They haven't really cracked that market yet. I did get to see some biomass pre-processing ideas or options that they were toying around with on these digestion facilities, but they hadn't picked their winner yet or said this is what we're going to use, this is how it's going to work. But they were looking towards the future and seeing some opportunities for innovation about what they might do or how it might fit within their system. So with that, I wanted to open it up. If any of you had questions, feel free to type them in the chat. But I think it was an interesting trip. It was not what I expected. The digesters were much bigger in scale. And Denmark looked at this and basically said, when they think about why biogas, they said because they have 13 million pigs locally that are producers, right? And I see a lot of the same challenges in Iowa. We have 25 million local producers who are ready to be a part of our energy picture and making agriculture more sustainable. So it was an interesting trip, different than what I expected, but it was great to see the professionalism, the intensity and scale that they were bringing to this to maybe bring some of the market options down. And also inspiring to see that how they'd found ways to work with farms of all sizes by moving manure around the countryside. So we'll stop sharing for a second. If you do have questions or comments, feel free to write them into the chat. Otherwise, I think I'm supposed to find my June moderator slides and give you a bit of more advertisement about things that we have coming up. So I think it should be that one. All right, so our next webinar will be on July 14th, again 1 o'clock, and we'll be talking about sand management and solid liquid separation challenges in anaerobic digestion with Andrew Wadle. Andrew's done a ton of work on sand separation on dairies, and I know that's still a continuing concern of how to manage some of that sand. So excited to see what Andrew is going to share with us. Really looking forward to it. He does have a huge amount of expertise on sand separation, and whether we're digesting or not, that's something that many dairies have questions or concerns about, so hopefully something that we can look towards there. We will have a new newsletter coming out soon. I think I owe one at the beginning of July, so if you're interested in our anaerobic digestion newsletter, you can see the website there. Go to Iowa State to sign up, or if you're watching on your computer, you can take your phone and scan that QR code, and it'll take you to sign up. We really just let you know what's happening in the world of anaerobic digestion in Iowa so that you can stay on top of what we are offering and the sort of news insights that are coming out of the state. And if you have an opportunity to share this with someone else who might be interested, you can direct them at our YouTube channel to see anything we've done in the past. All right, so right on time, 30 minutes. I know I kept you late the last two times, trying to get back towards maybe that 30 to 35 minute time period. And it looks like I have no questions today, so you're all letting me easy off the hook. But otherwise, thank you everyone for joining us. It was great to have you again this time, and hopefully you can join us next month for Andrew talking about sand separation. Okay, and then Paul did give me a question, and what was one technology or idea that you would like to introduce here? I think, Paul, what was really neat to me is they were taking solid manure, and we see almost no one doing digestion working with solid manure for a couple reasons. One, our current policy hasn't really supported that, right? When you think about what the LCFS markets have really done, they focused on avoided emissions, and solid manure don't have many methane emissions to start with. But there's a lot of solid manure that's produced. And Denmark said, we need energy, and we have all this liquid manure that's probably more dilute than it could be. So rather than focusing right on, we should just add biomass, we should add biomass crops, they said, let's work with solid manure. And they had found ways to make that work without grinding it up fine, getting it dry, right? So I think that was the first thing that really made me think differently. And then the second one was they were not afraid to haul manure to make economics work. And I don't think we've really seen that model in the U.S. They were hauling manure 10 to 15 miles to get it to the digester. And one of the concerns I've had about this is how do we help that 2,400, that 4,800 head swine farm get involved in digestion projects in Iowa. And we know they want the nutrients back. If they haul it to a digester, how do we make sure they get that? And Denmark had found a way to get through the value chain in the conversation to say, you're going to be a part of it, you're going to get some of the green energy credits back, but we're also going to make sure we get you a digested effluent product and return your fertilizer to your farm, probably with more nutrients in it than what we started with, right? So it can be value adding in terms of fertilizer and help us from a carbon and energy production market. So those were the two things I really took away. Is scale, I knew was critical, but I was afraid of moving manure across the countryside. And Denmark showed me that it can be done. We have to think about maybe that load-unload system, how to make it efficient, how to make it biosecure. But they had found ways to be successful at that. And then really focusing on it's an energy production system, not just an avoided emissions system. And it has a role to play. So I think they had thought really well from start to finish about what does this system look like, and they didn't get bogged in saying everyone needs to understand the system, but what's that value proposition for each person who has to be involved? How does the farmer add value? How do we make sure that the gas handling company who's moving it throughout the countryside, what's their role to play, and how do we make sure that they invest in it? And I think that's something that maybe Danish policy has done more strongly than U.S. policy is linking those together, right? So that everyone wants to play a role in making this come to fruition rather than, I think it's a great idea and now I have to fight that entire battle or climb that mountain myself. So I think that was the big one to me, though, is just the scale that we should be thinking about getting to is maybe a little bigger than I had envisioned. And that opens up some different fertilizer discussions than what we've had in the past. Great question. All right. Thanks, everyone. Great to have you as always, and hopefully we'll see you again next week to talk about sand separation. Oh, man. Okay, how is heat from the digestion utilized from Patrick? Okay, so they are, when you go to mesophilic digestion and heat to 65 degrees Celsius, a couple things. When you think about the Iowa countryside, there's not a lot of people out there. In the Danish countryside, digestion systems are often located much closer to communities than we are. So they would oftentimes be pumping hot water from the digestion system towards a community and recycling it back 4 or 5 miles, right? So you'd see pipes in the countryside that were moving heat around. And that works because they have historically had community heating districts, not infrastructure that we have in the US. But that was one way that it was being utilized. Even when they weren't doing that, they were using it to heat their digesters up. So when you go from mesophilic to thermophilic, 30 degrees Celsius is a lot of energy to be heating a water solution. So they were thinking a lot more about heat recovery. The other place that they really focused, membrane systems don't generate a ton of heat. Amine systems do, because to get that CO2 out of that amine solution, you're heating it up and causing the CO2 to off-gas. So that's a high temperature process, and that heat was coming back to heat the digester up to 65. So their heat recovery made their systems all more efficient. But I'd like to tell you, man, they were using all their heat, and it's easy for us to replicate that. I think it's hard for us to replicate some of that heat production, but especially as we think about, should we be increasing digester temperatures to maybe help hydrolyze some of that harder to digest stuff, like solid manure? Amine systems, since we got big enough where heat recovery where we can get the digester to 35 or to 65, might make some sense. Community heating, I mean, we just don't have the infrastructure here, and we're located out in the middle of not by communities most of the time, so that was probably not going to happen. But in Denmark, it makes tons of sense, right? And the trade-off they had for that was, well, they had to be more thoughtful about the odor control. Most of those buildings were running negative pressure, so they were trying to pull air in, and it did go to gas scrubbing systems. The scrubbing systems tended to be like what you'd see on barns in the U.S. where we have them. Wood chip bioreactors are similar, not advanced odor removal systems, but relatively simple, and that was the price to pay, but they could take better advantage of the heat. Okay, third time's a charm. So thanks, everyone. It was great to have you today. If you're out in Pennsylvania for anaerobic digestion on the farm, stop in and say hi. I should be able to see you in just a couple minutes. Otherwise, thanks, everyone, and have a great Tuesday.